Last week's 2 today, and then he was still free, which is great. Looking forward to hear what he's got to say. The Mendip Times, he's brought some extra copies. If you haven't had one this month, there are some on the back table, or there were. It's always, I think, something that people look forward to picking up and finding, seeing and reading. As he was saying, you do a lot of local history in there. Over the years there's been many, many articles, which are really interesting to read. But he's going to tell us a little bit about what it's like putting it together, how he started off with it, how it works now. And from my point of view, I always read the Mendip Times with a smile on my face, because everybody in there is smiling, and you get the feeling that everyone around you is doing wonderful things. There's such a community feeling about it. You know, they're all running through the mud or raising money or baking cakes, and it's just gives you that feeling that the whole community is really pulling together and doing great things. And it's all there in the Mendip Times, and no bad news. Steve was saying we don't print bad news, so that's a plus for us. And I'm delighted to say that in lieu of any fee, Steve's asked us to make a donation to Western Hospice, which is close to the hearts of many people in Blagdon. In fact, there's a spring fair on the 1st of April. We can plug for that. Are you ready to go? Are you ready?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think if you're happy to sit there, Steve, that's probably as good as any. If you want to stand, then and wave your arms around, then
I actually stand.
You will be a bit smaller. That's all. I'll make sure it's put there.
We might see better from the back standing.
I'll try not to move too much.
No, but you can see whether you're in the picture or not, okay?
Probably are.
Okay, over to Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm not sure the weather's any better tonight, but anyway, we're here. What I thought I'd do is I'll give you a sort of a resume of my career, which is basically the history of the media over the last 50 years, and then tell you a bit about Mendip Times, and then talk a little bit about some of the history groups that we do deal with, and some of the history stories and projects that we have tried to support over the years. So at the age of 17, I decided I wasn't suited for academic life, and applied for a job on my local newspaper as a trainee reporter. And this was up in Wolverhampton, working for the Express and Star. The Express and Star in those days was printing 275,000 copies a night. One of the biggest papers in Britain and one of the richest papers in Britain. It now prints 12,000 copies a night. And is still one of the biggest papers in Britain. So one of the big changes I've seen over the years is the demise, if you like, of paid-for press. And when I came up with the idea of doing this, the universal comment was, "You're bloody bonkers." It will never work. So at the age of 17, I turned up on my first morning at the Express and Star. They said, be here for 7:30. At 7:30, we were shown to the boardroom up on the 6th floor, which boasted the biggest boardroom table in Europe. They take the windows out to put it in. That's how big newspapers were then. And the training officer sat there and said, keep an eye on your glass of water. And at 8 o'clock, the glass is shook. And he said, that's the presses starting 6 floors below us. And if that gets into your system, you'll never forget it. And it's true. And we were given, to begin with, 6 intensive weeks of training. And I remember distinctly that one of the training sessions was, in some cases, you won't go out to interview people, you do an interview on the phone. So we're going to practice that. So you're going to be the reporter, obviously. I, the training officer, am going to be the subject, and you're going to phone me up and ask me questions, and then write a story about it. And afterwards, I was praised for my persistence. Praised for my persistence. He said, "You wouldn't let go, would you? You kept asking that question." You know, I do admire that. I didn't tell him I'd never used a phone before. I got the mouthpiece the wrong way around. I couldn't hear a word he was saying. So we did our training course, and I was packed off to Shrewsbury, which was one of their weekly papers. They owned an awful lot of papers in those days. And I was given part of Shrewsbury as my patch. And the way local papers worked in those days was that in your patch you went and visited various people every week and got snippets of news from all of them. So I covered Hull, Scots, Castlefields and a couple of other places. And I'd go and see the WI and get a little report from the WI. I'd go and see the Derby and Joan Club, I'd go and see the vicar, I'd go and see the minister, and write a little paragraph in the paper about all of these. And on my way around, if there were stories, if I picked up stories, you'd write about those as well. And one of the tasks we had was you had to go to the church and write down the banns, the details from the banns, so that you got the name of the bride and the groom, and you got back to the office and you sent a form out to the bride. If you'd like your wedding in the Shropshire Journal, please fill in the form and send it in. And when they came in on a Friday, the job on a Friday was to write up the wedding forms. The most tedious job in the world. A honeymoon in Tenerife followed the wedding of Fred and Marjorie. But if it went in the paper and there was a mistake and the bride's mum came in, you had to go downstairs and apologise to the bride's mum. And I tell you, that was one of the most important lessons I ever learned. Accuracy. You get the bride's name wrong and you're in deep trouble. Yeah. The other thing we had to do was phone up the undertaker twice a week and find out who died. And then at the age of 17, 18 I was then, trot round to their houses and ask if they wanted an obituary in the paper. And to be honest, most people said yes, although I was very young. They wanted to talk about their beloved. And the questions were always similar. Usually it was the chap that had died. So where was he born, where did he go to school, where did he do his war service, any other interests. And I went to one place and did all of the questions. And the woman looked at me and she said, "Would you like to see him?" This was laid out in the front room. So the best tradition of journalism, I made my excuses and stopped. Then I went back to the Express and Star, the big paper in Wolverhampton, and that was really, really busy. And I met for the first time there a chap called Alan Good, that we'll come back to later on. Alan at that time was the deputy news editor of the Express and Star, and his job was to allocate all of the diary jobs. So he had a list on his diary, like 2 pages, sometimes 4 pages. It would be every council meeting, every court, the industrial tribunals, hospital boards, you name it, they were all down there. And he had enough reporters to allocate them to every one of these jobs. And if I went to a magistrate's court in the morning, in the afternoon I'd be brought back to the office to write up whatever I'd done in the morning, and they'd send a second reporter to cover in the afternoon. So you imagine they must have had about 200 reporters. I should imagine now they've probably got 2, if that. And one of the pleasant jobs on the Express and Star was spot the ball. Spot the ball. Yes. Now again on a Friday, I don't know why it always fell on a Friday, I suppose it was a quiet day. On a Friday you'd be asked to go and inform the winner that they won the prize. And there was a formula for this, which was that the photographer went out and he bought a bunch of flowers and a bottle of champagne. And we turned up at the house, and my job was simply to say, "Are you Mr. Scroggins, is this whatever it is? Well, congratulations, you've won, spot the ball." And then we'd go in and take photos, at which point the photographer would suggest we open the champagne for the purposes of the photo. That was the first time I'd ever tasted champagne. Anyway, in those days you had to do a 3-year indentureship, an apprenticeship. And I was always really deeply upset that because of my age I earned less than the other trainees who started at the same time as me, all the way through. So on the day my indentures finished, I went to see the editor and I said, "I want a pay rise." And he said, "What?" I said, "I want a pay rise. I want £30 a week." "What, £30 a week?" He said, "No, I can't do that. I could do 28. And I said, "No, 30. No, 28. I said, "Well, in that case, stuff your job." I'd already been offered a job in Norwich for a paper called the Eastern Daily Press. Having worked on a weekly paper and an evening paper, I thought a daily paper might be interesting. So off we went to Norwich and lived in this idyllic cottage which had been owned by Ryder Haggard near a little place called Bungay. On my first day at the paper, the editor called me in. He said, "Mr. Egginton," he said, "we are a newspaper of record. We are the Times of East Anglia. What's your shorthand speed?" And I said, "Well, about 120, 140 words a minute." "Excellent, you can be our Crown Court reporter." So off I went to cover some of the most horrific cases I've ever heard at Norwich Crown Court. And if you go there to the press bench, you'll probably still see my initials carved in it, because most of the time you're covering Crown Court, it is so boring. It's just unbelievable. But on this one occasion I was there, and the barrister was in full flight, questioning the witness, and he said to the witness, "Could you describe the person you saw running from the murder scene?" "Yes, sir, looked a bit like him." Pointing straight at me. So the judge said, "Would you mind?" And I had to stand up and go in the well of the court and let everybody have a good look. So the judge said, "I hope you have an alibi." So life was idyllic, but the paper was awful. There was one evening I was on, and there was a huge crash. A fish lorry from Lowestoft had hit a car on the ring road and bent the car around a lamppost. It was absolutely horrific. So I went and saw the news editor. I said, "There's a big story breaking, we need to get out there." He said, "I'm sorry, old boy, the photographer finished at 8 o'clock. So we had to get the photographer out, which they'd never done before. So I decided that idyllic though life was, it wasn't for me. So I moved then to Birmingham to work for a paper called the Sunday Mercury, which was it's a pretty good paper. It was a mixture of tabloid journalism, some proper decent features, and an awful lot of sport. And I quite enjoyed it there. It was decent to get your teeth into, but my wife couldn't stand it. And I think we were 11 months in, that we were there for 11 months, I think 11 days and 12 hours when the bombs went off in Birmingham. And we were sort of, well, at that time we didn't have a phone at home, so you imagine what sort of state she was in, you know. And so we decided we'd leave Birmingham, and some friends of ours from Norwich had moved to Bristol and said, do you want to come and work for the Western Daily Press? They said, "There's some vacancies there if you want to come." So I said to the people in Birmingham, "I'm thinking of moving to the Western Daily Press in Bristol." And the response from everybody was, "Not Mad Eric." Because the editor of the Western Daily Press had a national reputation for being completely bonkers. And he was a superb editor, and he absolutely loved the paper. And I remember he called me down for an interview on a Sunday afternoon, and I got there, and he was sitting there, and he'd obviously been to the pub for lunch, and he was eating a cheese sandwich. And he said, "Would you like a sandwich?" I said, "No, I don't think so, I don't want a sandwich." "Right, looked at your CV, Express and Star, well, you're obviously good enough for the job, so I'll offer it to you." I said, "Right, okay, fine." I said, "Where is it, the job?" He said, "Forest of Dean." I said, "Where's that?" He said, "God knows." She didn't say God knows. He said, "But I suggest if you drive over the Severn Bridge, turn right, you'll probably find it." And he called in his secretary, Mrs. Stone. "Mrs. Stone, take a letter. Dear Mr. what was your name again? Dear Mr. offer you the job, blah, 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 blah. Salary of such and such." I said, "No, that's not enough." "Well, salary of such and such." "No, that's not enough." "Company car." "All right then." And she went out and typed the letter, and as I went out, she handed it to me. She said, "Are you mad?" So I went off to the forest, and actually I got on quite well up there. They're all bonkers. You know. But there was one particular story I remember. I'd heard that the dustmen in the Forest of Dean were working at fiddle. You can't put your dustbins out in the forest because the sheep eat them. So they'd go out early before the dustbins were out. They'd be back in the depot before the dustbins had gone out at all. And at that point, they were taking it in turns to knock a day off. So when they got back to the depot, the supervisor would say, "Sorry lads, such and such a crew's called off, can you do an extra round?" So they did an extra round, so they were getting all this extra money by fiddling it, basically. Anyway, Eric loved this story, front page lead, 4-hour-a-day fiddling dustman or whatever it was. And the next morning my phone went at 7 o'clock, and it was Horace Parks, the council's surveyor. "Either Mr. Egginton, I hope you're satisfied that he's gone on strike." I'm very sorry to hear it, Mr. Parks. I think at that time I was about 24, so in charge of all of these people. And they had reporters and photographers everywhere. I mean, Minehead, Weymouth, Salisbury, Swindon, you name it, right the way across the West Country. It was a massive organisation and a brilliant paper. It did really well. And I think my favourite job there was chief reporter, where I was working only for the editor and not for the news desk. So he would give me special assignments to do. And I remember one we did, we had to tip off that elderly people were being abused in an old folks' home at Stroud. So I went off to Stroud. I hired a room for the Meningitis Trust, because I knew them, so I had a phone. And I tracked down the families of some of these elderly people, and they took me in there, saying I was the nephew of one of the residents. And I got evidence from, I think, 6 residents of some of the horrible things that's been going on there. And the night before we did the story, we told social services what we were doing. The next day, the couple in charge was suspended and later jailed for what they'd done. And the families were absolutely over the moon that we'd done it. I think it just makes a point that journalism gets a bad name quite often, but it does a lot of good. You get serious journalism, it can change the world in some ways. So that was the Western Daily Press. Now the problem with the Western Daily Press was the editor at that time was Ian Beales, who was 36. The news editor was Peter Gibbs, who was 30. I was 28. And it's one of those situations, if I'd stayed there for 50 years, I might be the editor. So I decided that actually, I'll try something different. So I went to a new radio station called Radio West, which then later on became GWR. It was basically a pop radio station, but in those days it was covered by the Independent Broadcasting Authority, and they had to have a proper newsroom. So I ended up in charge of a newsroom there of 9 people, most of whom went on to do really good things. Steve Scott, I think he's still sports editor of ITN. Jonathan Pearce is at BBC, covers football. All kinds of people worked there. But it was a bit Mickey Mouse, this place. It was, the equipment was terrible. And I used to get sent to cover Avon County Council. The budget meetings in those days used to go on for about 24 hours. And they said, we want you to do a report every half an hour or so from the meeting, let us know what's happening. So I went, and the equipment was just dreadful. And what you get in that situation is you've got a microphone, obviously, to do your report, but you've also got what they call station feed in your headphones. And it's through station feed that you get your cue from whoever's presenting to actually do your report. And the station feed through the headphones, through this bloody pop station, was so noisy. All these people in front of me, the councillors, how can you hear pop music? Pop music? So I thought, God, what am I going to do? So I took off, we got a sweatshirt, so I took the sweatshirt off and my coat, and I wrapped the headphones in them, and I sat on the headphones. And I thought, I've got away with it now. And Bill Graves was the chairman of the council at that time. He came and tapped on my shoulder. He said, there's music coming out your arse. Oh, sorry about that. Anyway. So it's quite enjoyable. I mean, it's a good setup there. And the great thing it did for me was Radio Bristol Road was so horrified about how we were down the road that they phoned me up to give me a job and said, would I go and work for Radio Bristol? So I went there as news editor in kind of the golden era of Radio Bristol. Roger Bennett was doing breakfast, John Turner was doing mid-morning, Holly Lloyd was there. All really, really good people, and the audience went through the roof. It was an amazing time to be there. I'll come to it later on, but everything else that I've worked on, it's had its time. And I talked about newspapers being in decline. Well, independent local radio disappeared more or less locally. There just isn't any. Right, the BBC are now taking a hammer to local radio, so Radio Bristol's losing its staff. So you get another example of how things are going. So Radio Bristol, I then got a phone call saying, would I like to go and work for Radio 4? So I went up to London for a while as national news organiser, which sounds very, very grand, and actually is the easiest job I've ever done. But basically, all you had to do was keep an eye on stories that were breaking, allocate reporters, and then forget it, because the reporters would then work directly to the programmes or to the news desk. And I remember my first day there, the news editor said, in local radio, remember, BBC is a national international player. people will expect us to cover stories in the best way we can. So don't ever worry about spending money. Times have changed there. He said, I'll give you an example. He said, when Lockerbie happened, he said it was late in the evening. His first thought was, well, where is Lockerbie? And it's obviously in Scotland. He said, I'll tell you what we did. This is the way we did it, and this is what you'll have to do if you get a big story. We hired a TriStar. We told every branch of the BBC what time the TriStar was leaving. We phoned up Sky and we phoned up ITN. Do you want to share the costs? We left at 2 o'clock in the morning. We had a team in London booking hotels and transport and taxis. Every satellite truck and radio car from the north of England, from Birmingham right to the north, all went and headed there. And by 6 o'clock in the morning, we were live, both for radio and for television. That sort of gave you a fantastic introduction into how the BBC at that time would still operates like that as a story. The other thing that happened when I was there was that into how the BBC at that time would still operates like that as a story. The other thing that happened when I was there was that John Burt had taken over and had decided that the BBC, the way the BBC operated was old-fashioned. Basically, radio and television were separate. So if you had a big story, say in Bristol, you'd find that Radio Bristol would be there and Points West would be there, and then the Radio Force regional correspondent would come up from Cornwall, so he'd be there. Then the World at One might decide they wanted their own reporter there as well, so they'd send someone. Then the 6 o'clock news would send someone probably because they wanted it for them. If it was a really big story on an issue that was of interest, Panorama might send a crew as well. So you might end up with a dozen BBC people covering a single story. So John Burt said, no, in future there's going to be bi-media working. So people in radio need to be able to work on television, and people on television need to work on radio. And I was on the desk one day, and the phone went, and this chap said, here, I've just been watching the television. I said, yes. They got a chap on there called John Sargent. I said, oh yes. Now, John Sargent had been political editor on radio for years and years and years, and had just made his debut on telly. And this chap said, well, I shouldn't be allowed. I said, why not? He said, his face looks like the leftovers of a medieval banquet. I said, well, that's not very kind, is it? So that was enjoyable. I mean, that was probably the easiest job I've ever done. We were doing 3 12-hour shifts, then having 4 days off. And, you know, so you could work your, you know, your home life around that was very easy. But because we were into bi-media working, I thought, well, I probably need to do some telly. So I applied for a job back in Bristol, producing Points West, and got it. I'd never worked in telly. I thought, I'd looked at the people there, I thought, what Christ if they can do it, I'm sure. And so, yeah, I started producing Points West, and yeah, that was quite interesting. Telly is different. You know, all the rubbish of having a sound man and a cameraman, it's just so different to what I was used to. We had at that time we decided to have a new presenter, and a lovely lady called Susan Osman, who came to us. Now, Susan wasn't a trained journalist, and we've been used to having presenters who were trained journalists that could actually go out and cover stories. And all she could do was chat to her mates on the phone and get her hair done. So the editor said to me, for God's sake, find us something to do. So I said, well, she could do the headlines, probably. We'll give it a go. So at the top of the programme it says, welcome to the Points West, blah, blah, blah. Headlines tonight, blah, 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 blah. They're all pre-recorded. And so we gave Susan this to do. And the story was, they were building the second Severn crossing, and they were bringing in China clay spoil from Cornwall on boats to build the new Severn crossing. The headline that went out that night was, and why they're importing clay from China to build the new Severn Bridge. Not quite, Susan. Well, that was quite good fun. And I was there for a while, and then I got into BBC management, which was first job I had was manager of BBC Radio Gloucestershire, and when I went there, it's a very quiet place. And I remember the chief constable saying to me one Christmas, so I started in October at Christmas, how are you getting on? I said, well, I think we've sorted out a team. I said I've made some good new appointments. We just need a few stories, you know. So the first story we had was one you may remember. There was a chap called Safari Boy. He was a bit of a ne'er-do-well who was packed off on safari by the county council, you know, to see if that sorted him out. Well, that was a big national story. The month after that, we had necrotizing fasciitis, which is the flesh-eating killer bug. So that was a big national story. And then in October, I'd hosted a box at Gloucester Rugby. And we had the mayor there, and the bishop, and MPs, and you have it. And Gloucester lost to Orrell in the Pilton Cup. So nobody was feeling particularly chirpy. So nobody's hung around for a drink or anything. And so I was just helping pack up. And my bleeper went. And it said, body found Cromwell Street. So for the next, year, 2 years, I was in charge of the BBC's coverage of Fred and Rosemary West, which was absolutely awful. My main job was as a counsellor to the reporters covering it, because it was just so awful. So at the end of that year, we had the Sony Radio Awards in London, and we won. We were named Radio Station of the Year for the whole of Britain. And the BBC obviously thought, oh, this chap knows how to run a radio station. So I was then kind of packed off to various other places to sort them out if I could. So the first one I think was Kent, a couple of others. I ended up in Oxford. Does anybody know Oxford? Bloody boring place. Nothing goes. No. Apart from Colin Dexter popping into the pub. It's one of these places where there's a ritual, you know, a timeless ritual to what they do. And when you see them jump off the bridge, 2 maids running, you think, well, I've done that really. And then I got a phone call saying HTV are looking for a head of news back in Bristol. Would you be interested? And I said, well, which arm do you want to bite off? And we'd never moved from Bristol. My wife's a doctor, and all the time I worked away, I had, hired a flat or whatever, but I always came home at weekends. So I applied for this job at HTV, and at that time the place was absolutely booming. It was, the car park was full of porter cabins. They had so much work. They were doing network programmes for natural history, all kinds of stuff. I was doing 11 hours of news a week, plus 13 hours of regional programmes. It was incredible. And at that time, I then met Alan Good again. He'd been my first boss at Express and Star, and he'd now by this time become managing director of Bristol Evening Post. And he bought everything he could. He bought every newspaper in the West Country he bought. So he was, at the top of his profession. And I remember going to a Society of Editors meeting with him, and we're standing on the roof garden at Temple Way. I never knew there was a roof garden. I mean, all the time I worked there, I never got above the 5th floor. And we stood there, and he said, can you imagine the 2 ragged-ass kids from the Black Country would be in a place like this? It was magical, standing there looking at St Mary Cliff. Anyway, that lasted about a year, and then the internet arrived. And literally within 2 years, local press had lost their advertising, HTV had lost all its advertising, and there was a series of mergers in ITV, which meant that we were taken over first by Carlton, I think it was, and then Carlton merged with Granada to make a single ITV company, which it still is. It's now ITV West. The network programmes all went straight away. The regional programmes then disappeared, and they turned their attention to news and said, we're closing down Plymouth, West Country TV is going, and there's going to be a single news operation covering the whole area, so an area from Gloucester in the north to the Isles of Scilly in the south. And my reaction was, I've always worked in local news. I believe in local news. I'm not prepared to do that. So, in the way these things happen, they gave me a nice fat check, and I'm not allowed to say what a bunch of idiots they are. I obviously can't do that. But so I was left in limbo. What do you do? I was 52, I think, and you know, I was in a position then, by that time I was chairman of Society of Editors in the Southwest. I was on the board of the Society of Editors. I was on all kinds of government committees, as you do when you reach that sort of stage. And in the course of my career, the positions I'd been in, when I was at Gloucester, we had lunch with Princess Diana, because she was patron of one of the charities at Gloucester Royal Hospital. When I was at Points West, I did a documentary about CLIC, Cancer and Leukemia in Childhood Trust, and Bob Woodward had this plan to go international, and was talking to people in Moscow about opening a similar setup in Moscow, and had a promise of sorts from Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, to become the chairman of it over there. And I got a phone call just before Easter saying President Gorbachev will see you on Saturday in Washington. And the BBC being what it is, we went. I mean, myself, a cameraman, and Bob Woodward went, and we met President Gorbachev and Raisa we had a couple of hours with them doing an interview. So that was sort of the highlight of travel abroad. And then when I was in Bristol, because I was chairman of the Society of Editors, I was invited to Windsor for the Queen's Golden Jubilee celebration. It was a media bash, so there were national papers there, BBC, all this of it. And when we arrived, this flunky came over and said, "Are you gentlemen from the West Country?" I said, "Yes, we are." I said, "Her Majesty is expressly asked to meet editors from the West Country because that's the first stage of her tour. So if you wait over there." Sure, I actually came, spent about 20 minutes with us chatting. Just a little. And all the time she was talking to us, her glass was being topped up. And I thought he came up afterwards and said, "Thank you ever so much, gentlemen. That's brilliant what you're doing that." And I said, "Very abstemious, the Queen." He said, "In what way, sir?" I said, "Well, she was just drinking tonic." "I think you'll find there was a bit of gin in there as well." And then we got chatting to Prince Philip, and he's going on about bloody tourists. He said, "I had one woman last week, an American," he said, "and she said to me," he said, "I'm not kidding you not, she said to me, she said, gee, you got a great place here, but why build it on a flight path to Heathrow?" So that was good fun. So as I say, I'd reached the stage, I'd sort of quit HTV or decided to get divorced. So what do we do? You know, and my mate Mark Adler, who's my partner, we sat down and said, well, we've both been newspaper journalists, we both actually really enjoyed being newspaper journalists, shall we give it a go? So we thought, well, you know, why not? I'd always liked, the Western Daily Press used to do a magazine called West Country Life, and I'd always liked that, and I knew Tina Rowe did a lot of work for it. And I thought, well, that kind of lifestyle-y, you know, magazine might work. So we had a meeting with Alan Good and had a chat about it. And we decided the first story we would cover was Les Davies getting his MBE up at Charterhouse. You probably all know Les. So we turned up, we pitched up there, and Lady Gas turned up. Lady Gas was lovely. She either wore the blue dress or the red dress, and she was always late, but she was a lovely woman. Anyway, she turned up, she's about to do the presentation, and I said to Mark, "You've got a camera?" "No." "Have you got a camera?" "No." "Oh, bugger." Ross Anstey was there, who's a good friend of ours. Really good. I said, "Can you take some photos for us?" And she said, "Yes, she would." So she did. And we said to Les, "Look, we've got this mad idea for a newspaper or a magazine. Can we come and have a chat?" So we went and saw him up at Charterhouse, had various cups of tea, as you do with Les, and discussed the idea with him. And I said, my idea would be that we need some contributors, we need some expert writers. Can you help us? You know. So the stupid thing was, I'd lived down here for years and years and years, didn't know anything about this area. Knew everybody in Bristol, everybody. Didn't know anybody down here. So he said, well, walking, you know, Sue Geary, that's fine. Caving, Dave Irwin, who's dead now. Gardening, Mary Payne. And we went through this list, and by the time we'd finished with him, we'd got a list together of about, I suppose, probably 8 or 9 names. And most of those people still write for us now. And we've added to them over the years. So we've added riding and cycling and various others. So we've now got about 12 regular contributors, including your esteemed new resident, Dr. Hammond. So that was the core of the mag. We thought that would, you know, we've got that. So we set ourselves a target. So if we're going to do this, we want to launch it at the Bath and West show in June 2005. I think we took the decision to go for it 6 weeks before. And in those 6 weeks, we found our contributors, we found a printer, we found a designer, and off we went. And the first issue came out, it was 36 pages, had 29 advertisers, and people were absolutely gobsmacked. And when we turned up, it's glossy. Continued from there. Went down really well at the Bath and West show. And Alan Good, we went to see. I mean, one of the big problems we've got, or any publication has got, is eyeballs. If you haven't got the readers, you won't get the advertisers. So how do you make sure you've got the readers? And Alan Good's advice was, distribution is going to be key for you. If you go to a wholesaler like Menzies or WH Smith or one of those, they might do it for you, but they'll charge you, they'll put a cover price on of £2.50 and you'll get 50p of that. And if they're delivering 500 copies of The Sun to the newsagent and 15 copies of your mag, guess which one they're going to forget to leave? He said the only way to do it is to do it yourself. And which is what we did, right from day one. And the first one turned up, it was on one pallet. We stuck it in our cars and off we went. It now turns up, usually there's 5 pallet loads. And we've got a warehouse over at Temple Cloud that takes them off for us and helps us load the vans. So every month now we've got 3 vans out and 2 cars. We get them back on a Tuesday. They're all out generally by the Thursday, and by Thursday night they're generally all gone.
Yeah, it's true.
And then we start getting phone calls saying, can we have some more? The remarkable thing with it is that the distribution system, the way it's worked over the years, is that, okay, in a village like this, we leave them at the club and the shop and the pubs and so on. In other places like Greenall, we leave them with the milkman. He has 200 copies and he delivers a copy to every customer with milk. There's a postman over in High Littleton, I think it is. He picks them up and takes them to the old people in the village for us. We had a phone call from Uphill saying, we're part of the Mendips, we want them. I said, I haven't got time. There's an awful lot to do. We haven't got time to come all the way out there. So the Uphill Society now pick them up from us. They have 3 boxes every month and take them around Uphill. And there's that pattern is repeated everywhere. The goodwill that people show in distributing it for us is just amazing. So we're off and running, and the magazine has just grown like topsy ever since. Before lockdown, we were doing 120 pages. We had something like 120 advertisers a month. Then, of course, lockdown came. All the staff were furloughed. My wife and I, on our own, kept it going. So we were writing it, designing it, delivering it, and kept it going through that time. And it's gradually grown back since. We're back up to, we're doing about 84 pages now. The next one I'm just working on. There's quite a lot of material coming in. So at this stage of the month, we don't know how big it's going to be, because we'll always make sure that there's more editorial than adverts. So if we get a flood of adverts, we add extra pages, which is a nonsense. I mean, if you're a proper commercial outfit, you'd say, well, sod the editorial. Just have the money there. But we know if we did that, people would notice. And the feedback we get from most people is they love the quality of it. They love the fact that it is glossy. During lockdown we did try and save money by doing a less thick cover. It didn't work because the cover's just ripped. So we've gone back to doing it that way. I'm just going to talk a little bit about local history because we do quite a lot. I've made a list because I can't remember everything. In this month's mag, there's a piece in there about the Avon Marshes Centre and the new buildings that they put up. Sue's Walking this month was all about the Mel Stream and the sort of industrial archaeology down there. And quite often our contributors will put historic stuff in their columns. Les Davis is always banging on about the good old days. There's another piece this month on the Big Freeze. We did. We're quite keen on doing anniversaries, if you like. So it's like the 50th anniversary or 60th. 62, 63, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So one of the things I like to do is to ask people to write for us, give us your memories, and we've done that an awful lot with some of the local history groups where they've done, say, special booklets on First World War or Second World War or whatever. But we've actually asked people to write stuff for us. Because being an old hack, I'm used to seeing my name in print, but people aren't, and they love it. Absolutely love it. As I say, I'm just working now on the next one, and some of the history stuff we've got in the next one. There's a Saxon axe head been found at Frome. We've got a little piece on that. There's an update on a thing called the Godney Canoe. There's a preview of St Hugh's opening for the summer. There's a tribute, they're putting up statues as tribute to miners across the Somerset coalfields, opening a piece on that. The Swiss air crash was 50 or 60 years, or 50 years. So I've got a piece on that. The chap who does our caveman now, Phil Hendy, who's actually a really, really good writer. He's written a piece about there's some pottery been found somewhere in West Mendip in caves, and it looks as if it's been deliberately broken. They think it's Romano-British, but they're not sure. But broken at the time as a barrier between this world and that one. So that's quite an interesting piece he's done. And we've got another piece on the Big Freeze. Milkman from Chute Mendip who managed to get through with a toboggan. Which is nice. But yeah, so right from sort of early days, we were interested in doing sort of local history. My wife and I are both interested in it anyway. I think one of the earliest features I did was on Churt, the Charterhouse Environment Research Team. Ron Penn and his jolly crew. And then after that, Andy Littlejones wrote quite a few pieces for us. Tony Staybaker's written quite a lot for us over the years. So we're very keen to do sort of local history stuff. And the other thing we do in our listings at the back is, if you wanted to do it, is just do a note on speakers that are coming up or events that you might be doing, if you wanted to include those in there. The listings, I started doing them originally, and they're a complete pain.
You still like us to do it?
Yeah, well, I was going to say I don't do anything. My wife does them. Yeah, my wife does them, and she's quite strict. So if somebody sends it in and it's not in the right order, or it's too many words, she tells them off. But if you wanted, any time you wanted us to do any sort of features on your society, I know we've done your Finds Days, I think a couple of times. Any stories you've got, just get in touch. We're more than happy to receive. Is there any questions?
Any questions from anyone?
How do you see the magazine developing with the electronic publishing, the way that's going?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Most of the paid-for press have had it basically. I think what we can survive as long as we can maintain it as a free magazine, I think we will be okay. And I still think there's a market for people who want to actually hold something and read it. Well, you can read it online. Every single copy, well, not every single copy, but certainly for the last 15 years, they're all online. And if you go to them as well, if you click through the pages and there's a link on any of the stories or any of the adverts, you can click through to that advertiser or that story. So, you know, we do an awful lot these days on charities and community groups. Some months, 20 pages almost. And at the bottom, if they're raising money, we'll put a link at the bottom to wherever, so you can donate.
I just want to say it gets read in Australia online.
Does it?
Yeah.
That's one of the things we found. We used to have a lot of subscriptions, especially overseas subscriptions. And we know from anecdotally from families, you know, if we go around the families over here, they get sent wherever. But to be honest, subscriptions from abroad were such a pain. Because, you know, you'd get a cheque in Australian dollars. So in the end, when people say they want subscriptions abroad, they say, can you just read it online? Because it's basically just too much work for us to do it. Yeah.
Must be a lot of work anyway, putting all those links in.
I've got a chap that does that.
You were mentioning just now the Avalon Marshes, because I've seen this in there, and I think we will suggest that we perhaps have a trip there. From March onwards, they're going to be more open, so we'll try and arrange that. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, my hope is obviously that there's still going to be a market for printed, and as you say, I mean, I spent my life as a journalist chasing fire engines and covering murder and mayhem and bombings and you name it. And actually, there's a story I can tell you if we've got time about this. They sent me off to Belfast. So when you're a news organiser, if the bomb goes off in Belfast, you have to go. So go over and do a recce. So I went to the BBC in Belfast, and I turned up at reception, and I said, is Dennis Murray here? He was the TV chap. Oh, no, he wouldn't be here, no. Is Fergus Walsh here? Because he was the radio journalist over there at that time. Oh, no, Fergus wouldn't be here, no, not at this time. So I said, well, I'll go and check in. And they checked me into the Europa. And I said, make sure you're at the back. And I thought I checked in, and I went back. And I said, look, are they back yet, these chaps? And they said, no, they wouldn't, no. I said, well, where's the nearest pub? And I said, well, a bit of Linen Hall. I said, oh, not the Linen Hall, I'll go to the Linen Hall then. So I went to the Linen Hall, and the bar was completely empty. And I said to the barman, I'm Steve from BBC in London. I'm hoping to meet up with Fergal Keane, and Dennis Murray. If you should know where they are, or, you know, could you just mention? And he was just pouring me a drink. And Dennis Murray came and said, Steve, is it? That'll be 15 pints, please. The entire BBC was in the back of the pub. not the journalists,
You've clearly seen a huge amount from what you've told us. You've been around so many different areas of news, really, but it's fascinating. Are there any more questions?
You say you started in Northampton?
Wolverhampton.
Oh, Wolverhampton.
Wolverhampton. Not the Wolves. Yeah, Wolverhampton.
The Western Daily Press has been going for a long, long time, hasn't it? Because when
Yeah.
Sheila and I have researched the wars and things, you can go to the library and it's all there.
Yeah.
It's been really useful to get their cuttings.
I suppose one of the, it probably sounds a bit pompous, but basically what we're doing is creating a bit of history. You know, I remember in my first job at the Shropshire Journal, and one of the things you had to do on a Friday, when there wasn't much going on, was go into a back room, get the old copies out, and do a little feature 50 years ago and 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And all of the back copies are in there, stretching way back.
You've got hard copies of all of yours, have you, somewhere?
Yeah.
That's always interesting, that 25, 50, 100 years.
It is.
We used to live in Warminster, and there was a little Warminster Journal, very local paper, but they had that feature in there always.
Yeah.
Along with long, long reports of funerals with absolutely everybody there, and who they were representing as well, not just who they were.
I remember once in Shrewsbury there was a really big funeral, where they actually sent two of us to take the name.
Yeah.
And it was pouring down, absolutely pouring. And we said to the family, are you really sure you want us to do this? Oh, if that's what he would have wanted. So all these poor people in the rain, I mean, it's absolutely soaked. And again, if you make a mistake, you know, in report, you have to do a correction the following week. So in our report out such as a funeral,
But just before we thank Steve, I just remembered that next, you say caving, maybe you remember, our next month's talk is Peter Glanville. I don't know whether you've met him. He's done a lot of caving all over the world, but he also takes fantastic photographs underground. And so he's coming to present to us in a month's time. So I think we're really good. But thank you so much, Steve, for coming. Fascinating talk, and
you're welcome.
thank you very much. There are refreshments, so if you can't get them, we'll bring them to you. But there's tea and biscuits. And
You're welcome.
thank you very much. There are refreshments, so if you can't get them, we'll bring them to you.